1944. Northern France lay frozen beneath a low, colorless sky. Snow clung to hedgerows and cratered roads, muting the sound of engines moving somewhere beyond the tree line. Inside a German Panther tank, breath fogged the periscope glass as the crew waited, listening. The war in the East had already taught them what enemy armor could do. This, they believed, would be easier. Across the field, the silhouettes appeared. American tanks, boxy, tall, thin-skinned, M4 Shermans, advancing cautiously through the winter haze. To the German crews, they looked almost naive. Too high, too light, too vulnerable. Veterans of earlier campaigns exchanged knowing glances. Against Panthers and Tigers, these machines had no business being here. The first shots confirmed their confidence. A Sherman burned quickly, its wreck sending black smoke into the pale sky. Another pulled back, another appeared, then another. The Germans noted something strange. The American tanks did not scatter. They did not charge blindly. They adjusted. They repositioned. And as they did, faint voices crackled through headphones inside the German turret. Reports, coordinates, movement relayed with unsettling precision. What the Germans saw were tanks. What they did not yet understand was the invisible web binding them together. Behind the steel and smoke, something far more decisive was already at work. By the time American tanks began appearing in large numbers on the battlefields of Europe, German armored crews carried with them years of hard-earned confidence. Since 1939, German panzer divisions had reshaped modern warfare. In Poland, in France, and during the early stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union, speed, coordination, and aggressive leadership had shattered enemy armies that still fought with First World War instincts. German tankers were trained to believe they were the sharp edge of a revolutionary doctrine, blitzkrieg, where armor, infantry, artillery, and aircraft moved as a single striking force. This belief was not without foundation. German tanks were often technically superior on paper. By 1943, the Panther and Tiger had emerged as fearsome machines. Thick frontal armor, high-velocity guns, and excellent optics allowed German crews to destroy enemy tanks at distances where return fire was ineffective. Against British and Soviet armor, German gunners routinely scored kills before opponents even realized they were under attack. Survivors carried these stories with them, reinforcing a culture of confidence that bordered on contempt for inferior machines. When German intelligence reports described American tanks, that contempt deepened. The M4 Sherman was taller than most German designs, easier to spot, and thinner-skinned than Panthers or Tigers. Its main gun, especially in early variants, struggled to penetrate German heavy armor from the front. To German crews raised on the importance of firepower and protection, the Sherman appeared poorly designed, a compromise machine built for quantity, not quality. Many German tankers assumed American industry could produce many tanks, but few good ones. Early encounters seemed to confirm these assumptions. In North Africa, during the fighting in Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943, German crews initially inflicted heavy losses on American armored units. Poor coordination, limited experience, and rigid command structures left U.S. tank formations vulnerable. German after-action reports from this period described American tanks as easy prey when encountered head-on. The belief took root that American soldiers lacked the tactical discipline and battlefield instincts required for armored warfare. Yet even in these early clashes, subtle differences were already visible, differences German observers often dismissed. American units recovered damaged vehicles quickly. Losses were replaced at a pace that surprised German logisticians. Destroyed Shermans were hauled away, repaired, or replaced entirely within days. Where German units husbanded their tanks carefully, Americans seemed willing to lose machines in order to gain ground. To German eyes, this appeared wasteful, even foolish. What German crews underestimated was the philosophy behind American design and doctrine. The Sherman was never intended to fight alone or to duel heavy tanks at long range. It was built to move, to communicate, and to operate within a larger system. Most critically, nearly every American tank was equipped with a reliable radio as standard equipment. This was not universally true in German units, where radios were often limited to command vehicles or suffered from shortages as the war dragged on. German doctrine emphasized centralized control and individual tank superiority. American doctrine, still evolving, leaned toward coordination and adaptability. U.S. crews trained to report what they saw, request support, and reposition rapidly rather than stand and fight losing engagements. These habits were not yet refined in North Africa, but the foundations were being laid. By late 1943, as American forces prepared to return to Western Europe, the battlefield was changing. The United States had absorbed its early defeats and adjusted its methods. Training intensified. Coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air power improved. Radios became not just tools, but lifelines. Information moved faster than steel. German tank crews, watching Shermans roll forward through the winter landscapes of France, believed they were witnessing the same enemy they had already judged. They did not yet realize that the Americans arriving in Europe were no longer learning how to fight. They were learning how to connect. The American armored force that crossed into Western Europe in 1944 was the product of rapid adaptation rather than tradition. Unlike Germany, which had entered the war with a mature armored doctrine refined through years of experimentation and early victories, the United States had been forced to learn under pressure. Its tank doctrine was shaped not by theory alone, but by the practical realities of global warfare, long supply lines, varied terrain, and the need to support large infantry formations across multiple fronts. The M4 Sherman reflected these priorities. It was designed to be reliable, mechanically simple, and easy to manufacture in vast numbers. American planners understood that a tank disabled by mechanical failure was just as useless as one destroyed in combat. The Sherman's components were standardized, allowing crews and maintenance units to repair vehicles quickly using interchangeable parts. Engines could be swapped in hours, tracks replaced overnight. This emphasis on reliability meant that American armored units could sustain operations longer than their German counterparts, whose heavier tanks often broke down before reaching the battlefield. Yet the most decisive feature of the Sherman was not its gun or armor, it was the radio. American tanks were built around communication. Every Sherman carried a radio powerful enough to maintain contact with other tanks, infantry units, artillery observers, and command posts. Crews trained relentlessly to use these radios under stress, relaying enemy positions, calling for smoke screens, coordinating movement, and requesting fire support. Communication was not limited to officers, it was embedded in the daily routine of tank crews. The battlefield for American units was something to be constantly discussed and shared. German armored units operated differently. While German doctrine had pioneered radio use during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns, by 1944 shortages and production constraints had eroded this advantage. Many German tanks still relied on visual signals or pre-arranged plans once combat began. Radio discipline was tightly controlled, often limited to command vehicles. In fast-moving or chaotic engagements, this rigidity became a liability. Orders took longer to travel, adjustments were slower, individual crews often fought with incomplete information. American doctrine embraced decentralization. Tank commanders were encouraged to make decisions based on what they observed, supported by constant communication with nearby units. If a Sherman encountered a Panther it could not defeat, the response was rarely to fight alone. Instead, the crew reported the contact, marked the position, and maneuvered. Artillery could be redirected within minutes, infantry could be warned. Air support, when available, could be summoned with increasing efficiency as forward air controllers integrated with armored formations. Training reinforced this mindset. By 1944, American tank crews underwent intensive exercises emphasizing coordination rather than individual heroics. They practiced operating in mixed formations, adjusting routes in real time, and responding to unexpected threats. Losses were expected, but confusion was not. Radios ensured that even when tanks were knocked out, their crews' observations lived on through transmitted reports. German crews began encountering this system piecemeal. A Sherman destroyed in one position would soon be followed by indirect fire from unseen artillery. A Panther engaging from concealment would suddenly face smoke screens obscuring its optics. Flanking movements appeared faster and more deliberate. What seemed at first like American caution was in fact controlled aggression guided by constant information flow. This shift became increasingly apparent in Normandy's hedgerows, where visibility was limited and traditional tank duels were rare. In such terrain, communication mattered more than firepower. Shermans advanced not as isolated vehicles but as nodes in a larger network, reporting, reacting, and adjusting with each exchange of fire. German crews still believed in their machines. Their guns could kill at long range. Their armor could withstand punishment. But the battlefield no longer rewarded strength alone, it rewarded awareness. And as American radios filled the airwaves with orders, coordinates, and confirmations, the advantage slowly tilted away from those who fought in silence. The laughter that once greeted the sight of a Sherman began to fade, replaced by something more troubling, the realization that the enemy always seemed to know where they were. Long before American Shermans appeared on the frozen roads of Western Europe, German tank crews had already formed a clear picture of how armored warfare was supposed to look. Their understanding was shaped by years of success. From the opening campaigns of 1939, German panzer divisions had been the decisive instrument of victory. Speed, concentration of force, and decisive leadership had allowed German armor to rupture enemy lines and collapse entire fronts in days rather than months. Inside the Panzerwaffe, this success created a distinct culture. Tank crews were trained to value precision gunnery, discipline, and the decisive engagement. German doctrine emphasized destroying the enemy's armor directly, preferably at long range, where superior optics and high-velocity guns could decide the fight before the opponent had a chance to respond. Early victories in France and the Soviet Union reinforced this belief. Time and again, German tanks knocked out enemy vehicles before they could even return fire. By the middle years of the war, this confidence had become institutional. Newer German tanks reflected it clearly. The Panther, introduced in 1943, combined sloped armor with a powerful 75mm gun capable of penetrating most Allied tanks at long distances. The Tiger, heavier and more imposing, carried an 88mm gun feared across every front. These machines were not simply weapons, they were symbols of technical superiority. Crews trusted them, commanders planned around them, and propaganda celebrated them relentlessly. Against this backdrop, American armor was viewed with skepticism. Reports from intelligence officers and frontline units described U.S. tanks as numerous but unimpressive. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of American armored forces, appeared tall and lightly armored. Its early versions carried guns that struggled against German heavy tanks from the front. To German crews raised on the belief that a tank's worth was measured by armor thickness and gun caliber, the Sherman seemed fundamentally flawed. This perception hardened during early encounters. In North Africa, particularly during battles such as Kasserine Pass in early 1943, German armored units inflicted serious losses on inexperienced American formations. Poor coordination between U.S. tanks, infantry, and artillery led to confusion and vulnerability. German after-action reports from these engagements often described American crews as hesitant and predictable. The narrative was clear: American tanks were inferior, and American crews lacked battlefield instinct. What German observers failed to appreciate was the context of those early defeats. The United States had entered the war with little recent experience in large-scale armored combat. Its forces were still learning how to operate together under fire. But unlike Germany, whose industrial base was increasingly strained, the U.S. possessed immense capacity to absorb mistakes and adapt quickly. Losses became lessons. Defeats became training material. Even during these early encounters, German officers noted anomalies they struggled to explain. American units recovered quickly. Destroyed tanks vanished from the battlefield almost as fast as they appeared. Replacement crews arrived with fresh equipment and updated procedures. Where German formations carefully preserved their increasingly scarce tanks, American commanders seemed willing to trade machines for momentum. This approach appeared reckless to German eyes, but it reflected a different philosophy of war. American planners did not expect individual tanks to dominate the battlefield. They expected systems to do so. The Sherman was not built to be invincible, it was built to be present everywhere. Reliable engines, standardized parts, and simplified maintenance meant American armored units could keep moving even after sustaining losses. German confidence, however, remained largely unshaken as Allied forces prepared to return to Western Europe. German tank crews believed that once again, superior machines and experienced gunners would determine the outcome. They expected American Shermans to appear in predictable formations, advancing into carefully prepared kill zones. What they did not yet recognize was that the Americans arriving in 1944 were no longer fighting the war the way they had in 1942. Beneath the visible steel of the Sherman lay a developing method of warfare that did not rely on single engagements or individual victories. The American armored force that returned to Western Europe in 1944 bore little resemblance to the one that had faltered in North Africa a year earlier. Experience had reshaped both doctrine and expectation. The U.S. Army had studied its defeats with unusual honesty, identifying not just tactical errors, but structural weaknesses in communication, coordination, and command. From these lessons emerged an approach to armored warfare that placed less emphasis on the individual tank and more on the network in which it operated. At the center of this transformation was communication. American planners understood that modern battlefields were chaotic, fragmented spaces where no single crew could see the whole fight. Radios were treated not as auxiliary equipment, but as essential weapons. Every Sherman carried one as standard, and crews were trained to use them continuously. Contact reports were expected within seconds. Enemy sightings were passed along even if the observing tank was destroyed moments later. Information, not armor, became the first line of defense. This emphasis was reinforced by American command philosophy. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were encouraged to act independently within broad objectives. If a tank commander identified a threat he could not defeat, he was expected to maneuver, communicate, and coordinate rather than wait for orders. This flexibility contrasted sharply with German practices, which increasingly relied on rigid command structures as the war situation deteriorated. German armored units still possessed formidable tanks, but they faced growing constraints. Fuel shortages limited training and mobility. Replacement crews often arrived with minimal preparation. Radio equipment, once a German strength, became inconsistent as production faltered and supply lines came under sustained attack. In many units, only command tanks maintained reliable radio contact, leaving individual crews dependent on visual signals or pre-arranged plans that quickly unraveled under fire. As Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, these differences became stark. The bocage, dense hedgerows that carved the countryside into small enclosed fields, negated many advantages of long-range gunnery. Engagements occurred at close distances, often with limited visibility. In this environment, Awareness and coordination mattered more than armor thickness. American units adapted quickly, using radios to call for artillery strikes, coordinate infantry support, and reposition tanks to exploit fleeting opportunities. Sherman crews learned to fight as part of a system. When a German tank was spotted, the response was rarely immediate confrontation. Coordinates were transmitted. Smoke rounds were requested to obscure enemy optics. Infantry units were warned and redirected. Artillery batteries, sometimes miles away, adjusted fire based on reports from tanks at the front. Even air support, increasingly integrated into ground operations, could be summoned with growing speed and accuracy. German crews began to encounter an unsettling pattern. A Sherman destroyed one moment would be followed by accurate, indirect fire the next. Flanking movements appeared deliberate rather than opportunistic. Attempts to hold ground became increasingly costly as American forces applied pressure from multiple directions at once. German tanks were still lethal, but they were increasingly isolated, powerful weapons fighting in fragments rather than as cohesive formations. Behind this battlefield performance stood American industrial capacity. Radios were not scarce. Replacement tanks arrived fully equipped. Training programs emphasized communication discipline and coordination. Crews rotated out of combat for rest and instruction, preserving experience across units. Where German formations struggled to replace losses, American units absorbed them and continued advancing. By late 1944, German reports began to reflect a subtle change in tone. The Sherman was no longer dismissed outright. Instead, it was described as persistent, coordinated, and difficult to contain. Its strength did not lie in individual duels, but in the speed with which American units responded to contact. Every engagement triggered a cascade of responses that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. German tank crews still trusted their guns. They still believed in their armor, but increasingly they found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate their movements, counter their positions, and recover from losses with unnerving efficiency. The battlefield had become a conversation, and the Americans were speaking constantly. The transformation of the battlefield did not announce itself with a single breakthrough or dramatic reversal. Instead, it revealed itself through experience, through the changing perceptions of the men inside the tanks. On both sides of the line. Angle 1. The German tank crew perspective. For German tank crews, combat had always been a test of precision and nerve. Inside the cramped steel hulls of Panthers and Tigers, crews relied on disciplined gunnery, superior optics, and carefully chosen firing positions. The ideal engagement was clean and decisive. Spot the enemy first. Fire from range. Withdraw before retaliation. For years this method had worked. Against Shermans, the opening moments of battle often reinforced German confidence. At long distances, German guns penetrated American armor with ease. Shermans burned quickly when hit, their tall profiles making concealment difficult. To German gunners, these early successes felt familiar, proof that their training and machines still mattered. But over time, something began to feel different. Destroying a Sherman no longer seemed to end the fight. Instead of chaos or retreat, German crews noticed controlled movement. Smoke appeared with unsettling speed, obscuring sightlines just as German gunners prepared follow-up shots. Infantry fire intensified around their positions. Artillery began landing with increasing accuracy. What should have been a victory became a prolonged struggle for survival. Inside German turrets, crews strained to understand how the Americans were reacting so quickly. The answer was not visible through optics or periscopes. It moved invisibly, through the airwaves. German tanks were powerful, but they were increasingly blind, fighting individual duels while the Americans fought a coordinated battle. Angle 2. The American Sherman crew experience. For American tank crews, the Sherman was never presented as invincible. Training emphasized vulnerability. Crews were taught to expect losses and to survive them. The true strength of the Sherman lay not in its armor, but in the way it connected its crew to the larger fight. Radios dominated the interior of the tank. Orders, reports, and confirmations filled the headphones of commanders and gunners. Crews learned to speak clearly and concisely under fire. The sighting report was as important as a fired round. Even a tank that could not engage effectively still had value as an observer. This mindset reshaped how American crews approached combat. When encountering German armor, they did not rush forward blindly. Instead, they maneuvered, reported, and coordinated. One Sherman might draw attention while another repositioned. Infantry support was requested early, not as a last resort. Artillery fire missions were adjusted based on tank observations. Each engagement became a collective effort, rather than a solitary contest. Losses were heavy, especially during the early fighting in Normandy. But crews understood that their actions contributed to outcomes beyond their immediate survival. The destroyed tank still mattered, if its crew had transmitted enemy positions moments earlier. Radios ensured that no engagement ended in isolation. Angle 3. Technology as a force multiplier. Technologically, the contrast between German and American armor was stark. German tanks excelled in firepower and protection. American tanks excelled in reliability and communication.
These differences reflected broader industrial and doctrinal choices made long before the tanks ever met on the battlefield. American radios were robust, standardized, and widely distributed. Maintenance units ensured they remained operational even under harsh conditions. Training emphasized radio discipline, reducing confusion and miscommunication. Over time, this created a battlefield environment where information flowed faster than enemy fire. German radios, once a pioneering advantage, became unevenly available as the war progressed. Production shortages, fuel constraints, and combat losses reduced their effectiveness. In many engagements, German crews relied on visual cues or delayed orders, limiting their ability to respond dynamically. The result was asymmetrical awareness. American units often knew where German tanks were before the Germans knew they had been spotted. This did not guarantee victory in every engagement, but it shifted the balance steadily. Tanks became sensors as much as weapons, feeding a larger system that responded with overwhelming force. By late 1944, the implications were impossible to ignore. German crews still destroyed Shermans, sometimes in large numbers, but each victory triggered a chain reaction: artillery fire, flanking movements, airstrikes that eroded German positions faster than they could be replaced. The battlefield was no longer decided by which tank fired first, it was decided by which side understood the fight as a whole.
And that realization was about to shape the most decisive moments of armored combat in Western Europe. Angle 4. Leadership and command flexibility. The American approach to armored warfare placed immense responsibility on leaders at every level. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were trained to think, react, and make decisions independently, guided by overarching objectives rather than rigid instructions. This decentralization was critical in the fluid, chaotic terrain of Normandy, where visual contact was often limited and the front lines constantly shifted. American commanders leveraged radios not only to issue orders but to receive continuous updates from their subordinates. A single tank commander could request artillery, coordinate with infantry, or call for reinforcements while simultaneously engaging enemy targets. The result was a dynamic, responsive fighting force that adapted in real time. By contrast, German command often remained centralized. Even experienced panzer officers struggled when subordinate units acted independently, creating gaps that Americans exploited systematically. Angle 5. The enemy perspective. German after-action reports revealed a gradual shift in perception that Shermans imposed. Initially dismissed as easy targets, the M4's presence forced crews to reconsider their assumptions. Repeated encounters demonstrated that losing a single Sherman did not halt American advances. Even when destroyed, the tank's position, observations, and radio reports continued to influence the battle. German notes frequently mentioned the disorienting effect of this persistence, describing American coordination as relentless and unexpected. Moreover, German crews began noticing patterns. Tanks moved in concert, positions were reinforced rapidly, and flanking maneuvers appeared premeditated rather than opportunistic. What was once laughter at inferior machines was replaced by unease, sometimes bordering on disbelief. Reports often highlight how German units underestimated the speed at which Americans could adapt to losses and maintain operational momentum. Angle 6. Human and moral dimensions. Beyond technology and leadership, the human experience played a crucial role. For American crews, the sense of connection through radio communication offered both practical advantages and psychological reassurance. Knowing that support was nearby, whether from fellow tanks, artillery, or air units, reduced the paralyzing fear of isolation in combat. It allowed crews to act decisively, confident that their observations and calls for assistance mattered. German tankers, on the other hand, faced a growing psychological strain. Encounters with Shermans no longer rewarded individual skill alone. Crews who had relied on superior guns and armor found themselves outpaced by a system they could not see or predict. Fatigue, stress, and frustration mounted as the invisible network of American coordination repeatedly countered their most confident maneuvers. This shift undermined traditional notions of battlefield heroism, replacing individual glory with reliance on collective operational effectiveness. Angle 7. Tactical implications on the battlefield. Finally, the tactical consequences of these differences became increasingly apparent in combat. Shermans were not merely instruments of firepower, they were nodes in an orchestrated network that shaped the battlefield itself. German armor, operating under conventional doctrines emphasizing concentrated fire and frontal assaults, frequently encountered situations where the terrain, support units, and timely information combined to neutralize their advantages. American tactics exploited this. Tanks would deliberately draw attention, exposing themselves to enemy fire just long enough to relay positions. Flanking maneuvers were coordinated to coincide with artillery strikes or infantry assaults. Even when individual Shermans were destroyed, their crews' transmissions allowed follow-up units to avoid ambushes, target weaknesses, and maintain momentum. What looked like a vulnerable, lightly armored tank became, in practice, a force multiplier within a larger adaptive system. These angles together illustrate the fundamental shift in armored warfare that the Shermans represented. German crews continued to fight with courage and skill, but they increasingly faced an opponent whose strength lay less in steel and more in connectivity, coordination, and adaptability. The battlefield had become a web of information and rapid response, and the Shermans were at its center. The stage was now set for decisive engagements, where the invisible advantage of communication and coordination would redefine the limits of armored combat. The first weeks of the Normandy campaign exposed the true strength of the Shermans' design philosophy. On the morning of June 12, 1944, American armored units advanced through the Balkage country of the Cotentin Peninsula. Thick hedgerows cut fields into small, enclosed compartments, limiting lines of sight and nullifying many advantages of long-range German firepower. German tank crews, confident from years of success, awaited what they assumed would be routine victories. Panthers and Tigers lay concealed behind folds in the terrain, ready to ambush the approaching Shermans. Initial engagements confirmed German expectations. Several Shermans were destroyed almost immediately as they crested hedgerows, their tall, thin silhouettes making them easy targets. German gunners cheered. This was the battlefield as they knew it. Yet as the smoke cleared, a pattern emerged. Survivors moved not randomly but in coordinated formation. Radios crackled with reports from forward scouts. Commands were relayed in real time to adjust fire, reposition tanks, and call for supporting artillery. The battlefield, once a series of isolated duels, was now a networked system responding faster than any German crew could anticipate. One American tank commander, observing a Panther preparing to flank his unit, transmitted its position and orientation over the radio. Seconds later, two other Shermans adjusted their approach, while a nearby artillery battery redirected fire onto the hidden Panther. The German gunner fired, striking the lead Sherman, but the response was immediate. Smoke screens rose to obscure the Germans, and flanking maneuvers pressed the advantage from multiple angles. Within minutes, the Panther was neutralized, not by a single duel, but by a sequence of coordinated actions that German crews could not predict. Elsewhere, similar scenarios unfolded repeatedly. German crews noted, often in disbelief, that every American loss seemed to be compensated by a new deployment or an immediate tactical adjustment. Crews that survived initial hits relayed vital information. Tanks moved in synchronization, exploiting terrain, calling in reinforcements, and coordinating with infantry to close gaps. The Germans' reliance on superior armor and firepower alone was proving increasingly inadequate against an enemy whose greatest weapon was information and coordination. By mid-July, these lessons became stark during the Battle of St. Lo. German commanders attempted to concentrate forces, using heavy tanks to halt the American advance. Yet even when German tanks achieved temporary local superiority, American units absorbed losses and countered with well-timed maneuvers. Radios allowed units miles apart to act in concert, converging on enemy positions before the Germans could react. The psychological effect on German crews was profound. The confidence with which they had approached engagements was slowly eroded by the constant, methodical responses of American forces. German reports from St. Lo described the growing frustration. "The enemy anticipates our moves before we can complete them," one officer wrote. "Every position we occupy is observed, reported, and countered within minutes." The battlefield, once dominated by the most heavily armored tank, or the most experienced crew, now rewarded the side that communicated, adapted, and coordinated most effectively. For German tankers, each encounter with a Sherman became a test not of skill alone, but of their ability to comprehend a system they could not see. This period marked the turning point in Western European armored warfare. The Sherman was no longer merely a tank to be counted among the enemy's numbers. It was the linchpin of a coordinated approach that leveraged speed, information, and adaptability. Individual heroics mattered less than seamless integration within the larger system, and for the first time German crews felt that their advantages in firepower and armor were insufficient to guarantee success. In these opening phases, the stage was set for what would soon become full-scale domination, the combination of communication, coordination, and industrial support, transforming vulnerable Shermans into a force that the Germans could neither easily destroy nor predict. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the American approach to armored warfare fully revealed its potency during the advance toward Avranches and the breakout from the Normandy beachhead. German tank crews, once confident in their superior firepower, found themselves increasingly outmaneuvered not through better guns or thicker armor, but through the relentless coordination of American forces. Every Sherman, every observation post, every artillery unit contributed to a battlefield-wide network that German crews struggled to penetrate. At the hedgerows near Carentan, German Panthers attempted to ambush American units advancing along narrow lanes. A single Sherman was struck and immobilized, smoke curling into the gray sky. Yet within seconds, other Shermans adjusted their formations. Using radio updates, the lead units informed rear tanks of enemy positions. Artillery observers transmitted precise coordinates, calling down fire onto concealed German positions. Infantry squads moved to cover exposed flanks. The Germans fired again and again, but each attack was anticipated and countered with a fluidity they had never encountered before. The Battle of St. Lo further demonstrated the American system at work. German armored units tried to concentrate force, striking from strong points to disrupt the advancing Shermans. Yet Sherman platoons, connected via radio, responded with synchronized flanking maneuvers and crossfire coordination. Even when Shermans were destroyed, their crews' reports fed the system, allowing immediate adjustments by neighboring units. The Germans, relying on isolated firepower, were overwhelmed by a force that appeared omnipresent, adaptive, and impossibly resilient. By August, the breakout from Normandy accelerated the shift in momentum. American armored units advanced in waves, maintaining constant contact with one another, artillery, and air support. German crews observed with mounting alarm that losing a tank did not hinder the American advance. New Shermans replaced the destroyed, often arriving in coordinated formations that preserved operational tempo. German officers described the psychological strain vividly. "We are forced to fight not just tanks, but an unseen system that anticipates our every move." The Ardennes campaign later that year would further underscore the turning point. German units launched their last major offensive in December 1944, aiming to exploit perceived weaknesses in American armored units. Initially, Panthers and Tigers achieved localized successes, destroying Shermans and forcing retreats. But American forces adapted quickly. Coordinated radio communication allowed for rapid repositioning, precise artillery support, and timely reinforcements. German advances stalled as their tanks were systematically countered, proving that the Sherman's greatest weapon was not its 75mm gun or mobility, but the invisible threads connecting every unit on the battlefield. The German perception of the Sherman evolved dramatically. Laughter and contempt gave way to caution and eventually fear. Crews recognized that the battle was no longer decided by the first accurate shot or the heaviest armor, but by the ability to see, report, and respond faster than the enemy. By late 1944, German armored commanders were forced to confront a sobering reality. Their superior tanks were still lethal, but the American system of coordination had made the battlefield far less predictable and far more dangerous. At this turning point, a fundamental truth of modern armored warfare was confirmed. Individual strength, powerful guns, thick armor, experienced crews could no longer guarantee victory. Victory favored those who shared information, adapted rapidly, and operated within a cohesive system. The Shermans.
The stage was set for the final phases of the European campaign, where American armored units, integrated into a synchronized network of observation, artillery, and air support, would continue to overwhelm German forces. The lesson was unmistakable. In this war, the invisible threads of communication could turn even the seemingly weakest tank into a decisive instrument of victory. The consequences of the Sherman's coordinated battlefield presence became evident in the months following the Normandy breakout. German armored units, once confident in their ability to dominate engagements through superior firepower, faced mounting difficulties. Losses, while numerically fewer than earlier campaigns, carried disproportionate operational impact. Each destroyed tank meant more than just the loss of metal. It revealed gaps in German intelligence and highlighted the growing dominance of American coordination. By September 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward the Seine, German tank crews were struggling to regroup. Panther and Tiger units, previously the decisive elements of counterattacks, now encountered a system they could not penetrate. Shermans, advancing in coordinated formations, called for artillery strikes on suspected ambush sites, maneuvered in synchrony with infantry, and reported movements that allowed nearby units to reinforce weak points. Even where German armor achieved local superiority, the operational network of American forces rendered these gains temporary and fragile. Casualty reports from German units reflected both physical and psychological strain. Tankers noted frustration at repeated failures against what they had assumed were inferior machines. A Panther might destroy several Shermans, yet within hours American replacements filled the gaps, coordinated new assaults, and continued the advance. German officers recorded disbelief at the Americans' ability to absorb losses without significant disruption to operational momentum. The psychological effect of facing a networked enemy compounded the impact of each engagement, eroding confidence built over years of armored successes. On the American side, after-action reports emphasized the efficiency of coordinated operations. Commanders highlighted the value of radio communication, rapid information sharing, and flexible tactical responses. Crews were able to recover damaged tanks, reposition units strategically, and maintain pressure on German formations, often in terrain that favored defenders. These reports underscored a shift in armored warfare philosophy. The Sherman, though less heavily armed or armored than its German counterparts, became a force multiplier when integrated into a disciplined system. Strategically, the impact was significant. German forces could no longer rely on armor alone to counter the Allied advance. The combination of American industry, training, and communication allowed Shermans to maintain operational tempo across extended fronts. Local victories achieved by Panthers or Tigers were increasingly nullified by rapid American adaptation. This systemic advantage accelerated the collapse of German positions in Normandy, Brittany, and the Loire region, demonstrating that coordination and connectivity could outweigh raw technical superiority. In addition, the lessons learned by German tank crews reverberated throughout the Wehrmacht. Reports frequently acknowledged that individual heroics and superior equipment were insufficient when faced with an enemy operating as an integrated network. The Sherman, underestimated initially, had become a symbol of this new reality. German armored doctrine, still anchored in centralized command and reliance on technical superiority, struggled to adjust. Fuel shortages, communication difficulties, and attrition compounded the challenge, further emphasizing the tactical advantage of coordinated American forces. These early months of the aftermath illustrate a fundamental shift in the balance of armored warfare. Where German crews once laughed at Shermans, now they contended with a relentless, responsive system that neutralized their advantages. Coordination had become the decisive factor, redefining not only the outcome of individual battles, but the strategic trajectory of the campaign in Western Europe. The stage was set for the continuation of this momentum into the Ardennes and beyond, where the lessons of Normandy would be tested against one of Germany's last major offensives. The Americans' emphasis on communication, flexibility, and integration promised to transform every encounter into a trial of coordination, not just firepower. As the Allies advanced deeper into France, the operational superiority of the Sherman network became undeniable. German attempts to mount counterattacks revealed the limitations of relying solely on armor and firepower. Even when elite Panther or Tiger units were deployed to disrupt American advances, the effectiveness of these units was consistently blunted by the integrated system of communication and coordination that American forces had perfected. During the push toward the Seine and beyond, the rhythm of combat demonstrated a new reality. German tanks could strike with precision at short range, but each engagement triggered rapid American responses. Reconnaissance units reported positions in real time. Artillery units adjusted fire with unprecedented speed. Sherman formations maneuvered collectively, shielding vulnerable tanks and creating crossfires that German crews could neither anticipate nor outflank. Losses were absorbed and compensated by replacements, often arriving in coordinated waves that restored balance and preserved offensive momentum. The psychological toll on German crews deepened with every engagement. Many reported feelings of frustration and helplessness, recognizing that technical skill alone was insufficient against a foe operating as an integrated network. German tankers, once confident in their ability to dominate smaller engagements through superior optics and firepower, increasingly found themselves reacting to moves they could not predict. Confidence gave way to caution, hesitation, and in some cases outright fear. American after-action reports highlighted the significance of these developments. Officers emphasized that coordination and connectivity had become force multipliers. Radios, combined with disciplined training and flexible command structures, allowed units to respond in real time to changing battlefield conditions. Shermans, often outgunned individually, were able to achieve strategic and tactical outcomes that far exceeded what their raw specifications suggested. A tank destroyed in combat still contributed by transmitting enemy positions, guiding flanking maneuvers, or directing artillery fire, ensuring that no loss was entirely wasted. By the autumn of 1944, German armored operations faced systemic constraints. Panthers and Tigers were powerful but scarce. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and the constant pressure of coordinated American assaults limited operational effectiveness. Even elite crews found themselves outmatched by the speed, adaptability, and resilience of U.S. forces. Each failure reinforced the lesson that the battlefield had changed. Raw strength and technical superiority alone could no longer dictate the outcome of armored engagements. The strategic consequences were profound. Normandy and the subsequent advance across France demonstrated that the combination of industrial capacity, reliable equipment, and coordinated tactics could overwhelm a technically superior opponent. German forces struggled to regroup, and localized victories became fleeting. The Sherman, underestimated in early encounters, had proven its value not through sheer firepower, but by its integration into a broader adaptive system of warfare. Ultimately, the aftermath of these operations established a precedent for modern armored warfare. Coordination, communication, and adaptability had proven decisive. German crews, despite their skill and the formidable capabilities of their tanks, were confronted with an immutable reality. The networked approach of the Sherman formations had fundamentally shifted the balance of power on the battlefield. Technical superiority was no longer sufficient. Victory belonged to those who could act collectively, respond instantly, and leverage every asset across an interconnected system. The stage was now set for the final phases of the European campaign, where these lessons would be reinforced in the push into Germany itself. The impact of the Sherman's coordination would not only define the outcomes of battles, but also shape the evolution of armored warfare for decades to come. Looking back on the campaigns of 1944, the story of the Sherman tank is a story of adaptation, innovation, and the invisible power of coordination. German crews had entered the conflict confident in their superior machines, relying on armor, firepower, and tactical training honed over years of early victories. The Sherman, lightly armored and often outgunned, seemed at first glance an unremarkable opponent. Yet the war demonstrated that strength on the battlefield was not measured solely by guns or steel, but by how effectively forces could communicate, adapt, and act together. The radios embedded within every Sherman were more than instruments of coordination. They were instruments of strategy, turning each crew into a node within a larger network. Reports, sightings, and tactical observations flowed seamlessly across units, allowing commanders to make rapid decisions and maintain momentum. A destroyed tank could still influence the battle. A crew under fire could guide the next wave of reinforcements. Victory was distributed across the system, not concentrated in a single hull. This approach changed the human experience of war. American crews developed confidence not in the invulnerability of their machines, but in the reliability of the network around them. German crews, accustomed to dueling with enemy tanks on their own terms, faced the disorienting reality of an enemy who seemed to anticipate every move. Laughter at the Sherman gave way to disbelief, then to caution, and finally to an acknowledgement of a new battlefield truth. Historically, these lessons extend beyond Normandy or the hedgerows of France. They illustrate how industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and communication can redefine warfare. The Sherman's legacy is not in the tanks destroyed or the battles won, but in how it embodied a system that leveraged information, adaptability, and coordination to overcome raw technical superiority. It was not merely armor or firepower that determined outcomes, but the invisible threads connecting men, machines, and commands across the battlefield. In the end, the Shermans did more than survive German fire. They reshaped the understanding of armored warfare. They proved that victory belongs not to the strongest alone, but to those who fight together, think together, and act as one, a lesson that resonates far beyond the fields of World War II.